Hey, dear audience. Welcome back to the channel where we break down global financial shenanigans in a way that even your grandma can understand. Today, we're going deep into what's happening with the European Central Bank, ECB, and their latest flirtation with yet another delightful interest rate cut, because, apparently that's their magic solution to everything. Get your popcorn ready, folks. This is going to get interesting. Now, take a seat and let's unpack what's really at play. Because behind those sterile headlines, there's a truckload of economic issues that the ECB is either too timid or too clueless to handle. But, of course, it's us regular people who will bear the brunt. So grab some tea, and let's dive into this mess. Shall we? So here we are, days away from yet another interest rate cut by the ECB. Let's be honest. Can anyone actually keep track of how many of these cuts they've done in just the past year? Already, ECB officials are falling like dominoes, with hawks becoming doves overnight. 3 weeks ago, they were saying, "Oh, no way, we don't need a cut in October." Fast forward to today. The tune of "we need a cut, we need it now" is practically the ECB's anthem. Let's get things straight. Cutting interest rates is a band-aid. They are slapping it on a deeper, festering wound. Instead of dealing with the root causes of Europe's economic struggles, they've grown too comfy pulling the lever of monetary policy every time things don't go as planned. It's as if they're saying, "Oh, the economy's weak again? Cut. Inflation's not behaving? Cut it more." Let's zoom in on the data, folks. The ECB is under pressure after one major shocker surfaced last week. Inflation has fallen to just 1.8%. Let that sink in. For the first time in over 3 years, inflation is now standing under 2%. A target they've been fretting over for ages. It's like they finally reached the summit, but instead of celebrating, they're running scared. Why? Because the Eurozone economy looks lousy, and that's putting it lightly. The business surveys from S&P Global? Yeah, that came in much weaker than expected. Morgan Stanley and Barclays, who were both betting on a December cut, are now shouting, "Nope, it's now or never. Cut in October." In short, if Europe's economy were a patient, it's hooked to life support. The ECB's interest rate cuts are the only thing keeping it from completely flatlining. But can we really say cuts are the solution here? Let's dig into that. If you're the average person listening right now, let me ask you, when was the last time an ECB rate cut helped your business grow? Have you really seen any benefit from cheaper borrowing costs? Didn't think so. Spoiler alert, it hasn't worked for a lot of people. But hey, let's keep the facade alive, right? For years, the ECB has been on a crusade to bring inflation to their precious 2% target. But after dragging the economy through sluggish growth, they've hit a wall of sticky domestic inflation. That's right, folks, the worst kind. Services inflation, still hanging on tight. Wages, not moving much either. So what's the go-to move? A rate cut. Because clearly we haven't learned from doing the exact same thing for months on end. Now comes my favorite part, how the Federal Reserve over in the US, yes, Jerome Powell and his crew, set the stage for all of this. Europe's policymakers, like the ECB President Christine Lagarde, are getting juiced up by the Fed's very public stance toward easing rates. Oh, so the Fed's loosening policy? Why not hop on the bandwagon, right? I love how Lagarde subtly pointed out that recent data, yes, the one showing that inflation basically tripped over itself down to 1.8%, gives them reason to believe that inflation is finally under control. The latest developments strengthen our confidence that inflation will return to target, she boldly declared. Christine dear, we hope you're right. But when you've been pounding the rate cut hammer for months and suddenly the economy can't move, it's starting to smell less like policy success and more like desperation. Now, let's not get too lost in the numeric whirlwind. What does all this economic mumbo-jumbo boil down to? That there's not just one issue here. It's a choose-your-own-adventure of doom. Stagflation is all the rage in Europe right now. Weak economic growth combined with stubborn inflation. Sound familiar? It should, because it's the 1970s all over again. But instead of bell-bottoms and disco, it's sluggish GDP growth, wage stagnation, and, oh right, housing markets teetering on the edge. ECB officials like Latvia's Martins Kazaks are now sheepishly admitting that economic risks are more balanced. That's coded language for, we don't know what's coming, but it probably won't be pretty. Even the hawkish Isabel Schnabel, part of the ECB's resident anti-rate cut squad, remarked on the dire state of the Eurozone economy. But ultimately, they're all slowly bending their knees to the rate cut gods, because doing nothing means admitting they've run out of ideas entirely. Let's look closer at business sentiment. Declining business confidence across the board? Check. Enterprises hesitant to invest and expand? You betcha. When people and companies aren't in the mood to spend, how much exactly do you think another rate cut will move the needle? It's a drop in the ocean. Consumers and businesses have already lost confidence. Cutting rates further might make borrowing cheaper, but it doesn't fix declining consumer sentiment or investor paperwork gathering dust. At this point, anyone paying attention should be asking, what exactly have all these cuts achieved so far other than dragging everyone deeper into debt? So, we've established the ECB is set on cutting rates. But what happens later? There's a question nobody seems willing to address directly. What happens when they run out of room to cut? How much longer are we pretending like there's endless runway left for this stuff? Mario Centeno of Portugal is already antsy, saying, speed is of the essence. Well, Mario, speed towards what? Another cut that buys you a few more months but doesn't address the core symptoms of chronic economic stagnation? Sure, speed all you want. But the wall is not far ahead now, and there's only so much time left before you crash into it. The ECB finds itself between a rock and a hard place with no good options. They've pumped so much air into the economy with loose money. The only thing left to do is pray that somehow inflation and growth magically balance themselves. Great strategy, huh? Let's not overlook the wider geopolitical landscape here. The euro has been significantly weakened, especially in comparison to the US dollar. And with global pressures from things like China's economic slowdown, rising energy prices, and yes, a persistently shaky US-China relationship that threatens global stability, European markets are feeling the heat. You think a 0.25% interest rate cut is going to fix all that? Maybe the most alarming part of this whole story is that the ECB is risking its credibility as a central bank capable of managing crises. Once you've cut rates into oblivion and growth still weakens, then what? Do you start charging banks for depositing overnight? Get paid to borrow money? On paper, we see a rate cut of 0.25%, but what this really signals is a full-scale panic mode at the ECB. Imagine investors looking in. Just a few months ago, we weren't supposed to see any cuts until December. Now, everyone from Morgan Stanley to Barclays is pulling ahead their predictions, practically screaming imminent recession. If the ECB continues down this road, it'll be known forever as the central bank that couldn't rescue Europe from its own disillusionment. In conclusion, here's the burning question we have to ask. Is the ECB out of tricks? It looks like they have half-heartedly hit the repeat button on rate cuts because they lack vision, and they're stuck in an outdated policy playbook that worked in the early 2000s, but which can no longer revive what's fundamentally broken today. Today, corporate profits, high debt levels, and geopolitical fires are eating up everything in sight. But mark my words, this path the ECB is on will not be the salvation they hope it to be. If these rate cuts are the disease instead of the cure, buckle up, we're in for a bumpy ride. And with that, my dear viewers, I leave you to ponder what all these financial acrobatics mean for your savings, your job, and the future economy we're all part of. Be ready for more uncertainty, be wary of gimmicky answers, and keep your eye out for the economic cracks that are widening right beneath your feet. Friends, we need to go deeper into why a rate cut might not only be ineffective but potentially dangerous. As we've already discussed, the ECB is playing finger puppets with these rate cuts, hoping it will magically make things better. However, what they're not addressing is Europe's fiscal dilemma. The individual governments of Europe are drowning in debt. Italy, an eye-popping debt-to-GDP ratio of nearly 145%, one of the highest in the world. Then there's France, teetering at 112%. And while Germany's economy was once the shining beacon of European industry, even its growth has stalled, with forecasts painting a gloomy picture of a post-pandemic hangover that just won't quit. What room do these governments have for expansive policies? Not much, my friends, not much. But here's where things get spicy. What happens when you cut rates to the point where the only people benefiting are those sitting on piles of debt and those who still have the stamina to keep borrowing? And who bears the biggest risk? Ding, 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 taxpayers. You've got countries with struggling public finances relying on artificially low interest rates to keep borrowing costs manageable. What could possibly go wrong? We're staring at the prospect of stagflation, a slowdown in growth, and yet, the ECB seems laser-focused on one-dimensional, myopic solutions. Their fiscal counterpart, the Eurozone's governments, are strangled by debt but unwilling to fix their own house. By cutting rates even further, the ECB is effectively giving these governments the green light to continue borrowing heavily instead of addressing the structural issues. Low productivity, weak investment in innovation, and a lethargic labor market. Let's not forget the monstrous elephant in the room. Quantitative easing, QE. Remember, this is the ECB's break glass in case of emergency lever. When rate cuts no longer do the trick, they bring out the big bazooka of buying up more bonds, sucking up debt like a vacuum cleaner. The idea being that QE would pump more money into the economy, increase lending, and stimulate business activity. Works on paper, right? Well, not exactly. If we look back at the ECB's previous rounds of QE, how much has it really done to boost real economic activity? What did we see? Asset bubbles. Stock prices skyrocketed. Wealth inequality worsened. But most ordinary citizens? They saw modest gains at best. Wages have barely budged. Pensions remain under pressure. And the disparity between rich and poor grew. Don't be fooled by the stock indexes, which, by the way, are often padded by extremely low borrowing costs that make risky speculative behavior compelling to investors. The bigwigs at the ECB will proudly point to the fact that their QE programs, in conjunction with negative rates, are fighting off deflationary threats and have saved the European economy from worse outcomes during crises like the Eurozone debt crisis of 2010 or the COVID-19 pandemic. But if we look closer, this so-called saving wasn't a solution at all. It was more like sweeping the dirt under the rug. Question: how many more times can the ECB fire up the QE printing press before inflation targets get truly out of whack? Or worse yet, they lose control of the entire monetary system. QE might work for a while, but it doesn't fix anything permanent. It creates an illusion of prosperity or at least stability that is as fragile as a house of cards. Oh, and how could we forget inflation? ECB President Christine Lagarde said inflation is returning to target, whatever that means in their jargon-packed world. But can we really trust that narrative? In September, inflation came down to 1.8%, slightly below that almighty 2% magic number. Yay, right? Well, hang on a second. Keep in mind that while headline inflation is dropping, core inflation, which strips out the volatile stuff like energy and food, is stickier. The costs of services are sticking around like unwanted guests at a party. Rents up, services are pricier, and let's not forget the absurd spike in energy costs we've seen globally. The ECB may not talk about it openly, but those lingering inflation headaches will not go away overnight with a mere tap of the rate hammer. In fact, trimming rates further could ignite some inflationary pressures in the future, particularly if supply-side constraints rear their heads again. But inflation will likely evolve in weird and worrying ways, sticking stubbornly to some areas like food and housing, while hollowing out others. Europe could be plunged into a situation where economic divergence grows sharper. The rich can insulate themselves from these effects, but for everyone else, costs are still climbing while wages barely limp along. Let's shift focus to another major factor misfiring in this whole ECB charade: investor sentiment. What's been propping up stock markets, bonds, and asset prices? Over the last near decade, it's been the ECB's ambiguity on future rates and the unlimited money printing that's made speculation attractive. But this house can only stand as long as investors believe in it. Global uncertainties are rising, my friends. The U.S. is showing signs of resilience after its Federal Reserve's rate hikes, but it's anyone's guess where the U.S. economy is heading in 2024, especially with the uncertainties around the U.S. presidential election, potential trade disputes kicking off again, and what's turning out to be a long, drawn-out conflict in Ukraine. If there's one thing investors hate, it's uncertainty, and the ECB's indecision is feeding that fear monster. The euro's weakening against the dollar. What an embarrassment for a currency bloc that once prided itself on being a powerhouse rivaling the US. And in an interconnected world where geopolitical instability reigns, Europe's pushing its economy over the edge. Let's make no mistake. We could be seeing early signs of a domino effect with corporate defaults, tightening credit markets, and perhaps even a banking crisis if there's another economic shock looming. Would a 0.25% rate cut even help? Absolutely not. These band-aid solutions might keep the markets afloat for now, but the cold reality is it's a bubble, and bubbles burst eventually. Now, to bring it back to what really matters, you, the everyday people who are most affected by this high finance circus. Does all this rate-cutting trickle into an improved life for you? Not really. If you're a small business owner in Spain or a family trying to buy a flat in Italy, or a student working to pay down your massive debt in France or Germany, these cuts might even make things worse in the long run. First of all, if you're trying to save money for the future, where do you even put that money to work? Interest rates on savings are non-existent, so guess you can just hope inflation doesn't eat away your buying power, right? The ECB's policies, while inflating asset prices, have done very little to support institutional reforms or boost real wage growth. And now, with costs of basic necessities creeping up as inflation stays sticky in all the wrong places, how does life improve for the average person? True, borrowing may get cheaper, but what if wages don't grow? What if real investments in infrastructure, technology, or education keep getting sidelined by this fixation on monetary fine-tuning? And let's talk about housing. In major European cities, housing prices continue to soar, making homeownership a pipe dream for younger generations. These rate cuts might make mortgage rates marginally lower today, but given how overheated the real estate market already is, the larger problem persists. Prices are just too damn high. And if the ECB doesn't focus on long-term structural reforms, this vicious cycle will only worsen, sucking more young people into the rent trap, while wealthy asset owners prosper off rising property values. Wrapping this up, let's return to the main question. Where is the ECB headed? In the short term, the ECB will likely continue its rate cut and liquidity-fueled approach, patching the holes and hoping it's all about buying time. They're betting the farm that anything will solve the major structural weaknesses plaguing the Eurozone. Maybe they think the global economy will miraculously turn a corner. But after years of this strategy, are we seeing that result? Nope. How long will it take before policymakers realize that supply-side reforms, not endless rate cuts, are the real key to securing Europe's economic future? Investments in infrastructure, labor market reforms, promoting innovation, these are the hard solutions no one wants to talk about because they aren't quick fixes, and they certainly aren't as headline-grabbing as slashing rates. Until then, friends, brace yourselves. More rate cuts are on the way, and we may be looking at an ECB sliding down a slippery slope from which there's no clear recovery. As always, stay sharp, stay informed, and keep questioning why the big guys in suits think they know better while the rest of us feel the consequences of their mistakes. Is the ECB playing with fire? You bet. To be frank, they're not just playing with fire, they've already started the blaze, and now they're fanning the flames with every rate cut, hoping that somehow it'll put the fire out. It's like trying to douse a forest fire by spitting on it. The ECB's balance sheet has ballooned to over 8 trillion euros, swollen with years of quantitative easing, bond buying, and now another looming interest rate cut. And yet, the deeper we go into this monetary madness, there's a growing realization that, at some point, they'll simply run out of options. But here's what makes the situation even more precarious. The next crisis may not be one that policy rates can even touch. We're talking structural economic problems, demographics that are getting worse, soaring public debts across the Eurozone, productivity stagnation, and escalating geopolitical uncertainty. Rate cuts don't solve these problems. If anything, they're becoming crutches, delays, mere stops along the road to a bigger crisis. Let's not dodge the elephant in the room. Europe is aging, and rapidly. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, and nobody seems to want to talk about it openly enough. Many European countries, including Germany, Italy, Spain, and France, are experiencing shrinking workforces while their populations rapidly age. What does this mean for the financial system these rate cuts are supposedly supporting? It means two things. One, pension liabilities are exploding. Just take a look at France or Italy, where government pension expenditures make up a significant chunk of public spending. As more people retire and fewer people are working or earning decent wages, how sustainable is this? 2. An inelastic labor force. Aging populations aren't dynamic labor markets. You can lower borrowing costs all you want, but if businesses can't find workers, or workers can't upskill rapidly, you're not going to see any long-term growth. Instead of cutting interest rates, what Europe needs is comprehensive labor market reforms, productivity enhancements, and immigration policies that counterbalance these demographic shifts. Let's talk some numbers, shall we? Germany's Federal Employment Agency warns that the country will face a shortfall of up to 7 million skilled workers by 2035 unless it takes action to attract skilled immigrants. Italy already suffers from one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the EU, hovering at around 23% as of early 2024. And while they push interest rates lower, to what effect? Unless they can fix labor market participation, These rate cuts are like putting band-aids on a gaping wound. As if demographic trends weren't bad enough, Europe also faces a productivity crisis. Productivity, that magic word that determines whether businesses can make more with less, has been stagnant for years, especially when compared with the US. For context, in 2022, Germany's productivity grew by just 0.3% compared to 2.5% in the United States. The Eurozone's largest economy is barely crawling forward, and it's not the only one suffering from this malaise. Across Europe, the value added per worker is abysmally low, even in strong economies. Here's the trick the ECB doesn't want to tell you. Cutting rates doesn't raise productivity. It might make financing cheaper, but what's the point if businesses aren't investing in innovation, automation, or human capital? Short-term borrowing costs don't push companies to modernize or upskill their workers. True productivity growth comes from investing in technology, education, and innovation. To put it bluntly, Europe is 2 technological revolutions behind. The US has powered ahead with its digital and green revolutions, and China is catching up too. Meanwhile, Europe is trapped, debating whether a narrow rate cut will stimulate growth, as if that alone could make them compete in the global tech landscape. Case in point, tech spending. The European Union spends far less on technology R&D than the US or China. According to OECD data, Europe's annual R&D spending hovers around 2% of GDP, compared to 2.83% in the US and 2.4% in China. How does cutting rates help if businesses don't reinvest those savings into innovation? It doesn't. Productivity isn't going anywhere until policymakers accept that meaningful reform, fiscal reform, regulatory reform, labor market reform, is more important than lowering loan costs. Let's revisit sovereign debt across the Eurozone, because this is where things get even scarier. The ECB's rate cuts are, in part, an attempt to keep borrowing costs low for national governments whose books are already drenched in red ink. But just because you can borrow more cheaply doesn't mean you should. Europe's public debt problem is bordering on catastrophic. Take Italy, for example, where public debt stands at about 145% of GDP, one of the highest in the world. Riding a wave of cheaper borrowing through ECB cuts, Italy has been able to continue financing its enormous debt at relatively low interest rates. But should inflation rise or borrowing costs tighten, it will be a financial calamity not only for Italy but for the entire EU, since the banking system is tightly interconnected. But Italy is not alone. France is heading towards a 110% debt-to-GDP ratio in the next year, well above the maximum 60% Maastricht criterion that Eurozone members are supposed to adhere to. Even Germany, once the thrifty driver of Eurozone discipline, has suspended its debt brake rule and allowed public debt to balloon. Public investment increased dramatically as governments pulled out all the stops during the pandemic, and while it was necessary in the short term to avoid disaster, the longer-term consequences of carrying this debt load will be brutal if borrowing costs rise back up. Compounding the issue, we have Slovenia and Portugal, whose central bankers are essentially waving the white flag, joining the call for rapid rate cuts so their debt-laden economies can survive a bit longer. But at what cost? Their short-sightedness fails to recognize that continuing to pile on more public debt with artificially low interests is postponing the inevitable. At some point, creditors start demanding higher risk premiums, and when that day comes, countries with weak finances will see their borrowing costs suddenly spike, triggering a debt spiral. Boom! Then comes the bailout, austerity measures, and economic collapse. Hello, déjà vu of the 2010 euro debt crisis. Here's another underappreciated part of the equation: trust in the ECB itself. Central banks, after all, run on one thing above all else: credibility. The markets, investors, businesses, and the public need to genuinely believe that the ECB has the tools, the mandate, and the competence to steer the Eurozone's economy through troubled waters. But what happens when this trust starts to erode? By consistently shifting gears, first promising rate cuts, then backing off, then suddenly cutting again, the ECB runs the risk of becoming the boy who cried rate cut. By separating monetary policy from sound, data-driven decision-making, they could lose the confidence of the markets altogether. And when that happens, markets become unmoored, volatility spikes, and financial conditions tighten unpredictably, creating an even larger mess for policymakers to clean up. Remember, credibility isn't a renewable resource. Every rate cut that doesn't produce results, every decision that's perceived as short-term panic rather than long-term thinking, chips away at the foundation upon which European monetary policy is built. Investors start asking, what's next? Does the ECB really have this under control? The answer increasingly appears to be no. While we've been focusing intensely on domestic Eurozone issues, we can't ignore the broader global backdrop. Europe's central bankers are pretending as though the Eurozone exists in a vacuum, but it really doesn't. Global pressures are mounting, and the Eurozone is far from isolated. The ongoing US-China trade war, geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe, particularly with Russia's war in Ukraine, and emerging markets that are threatened by rising global interest rates are all factors the ECB can't afford to ignore. As countries like China face their own financial slowdowns, and as de-risking becomes the new norm in international trade, it's naive to think that lowering interest rates is going to provide any buffer for the kind of external shocks that seem almost inevitable in this global environment. Moreover, Europe is incredibly reliant on energy imports, which makes it uniquely vulnerable in times of geopolitical disruption. Case in point, look at what's happened since the Ukraine war began. Energy prices skyrocketed across the Eurozone. Despite recent years of trying to transition to renewables, many European countries, especially Germany, are still overly dependent on imported natural gas. Monetary policy has almost no impact on energy prices, leaving Europe especially vulnerable to external disruptions. Now, with all this talk of doom and gloom, is there anything Europe can do? Absolutely. But, spoiler alert, it's not going to be found in more rate cuts or injections of easy money. At some point, Europe needs to recognize that this is a multidimensional crisis that requires far more than the ECB's one-size-fits-all firefighting approach. Real solutions to Europe's long-standing economic problems demand bold, structural reforms that require not just action from central bankers, but from national governments, business leaders, and regional policymakers. So what's the way out of this economic quagmire? Let me say this loud and clear. One of the biggest mistakes Europe has made, and continues to make, is relying excessively on the ECB's monetary policy as a fix for problems that are deeply structural. No matter how many times you cut interest rates, you cannot paper over the cracks in the foundation of an economy. Europe is in desperate need of comprehensive structural reforms, and if those reforms don't come soon, no monetary trick will save it from stagnation. Let's start with labor market reforms. Europe, and especially countries like Italy, Spain, and France, is facing a serious mismatch between available jobs and skilled workers. Restrictive labor laws in many European countries make it difficult for companies to preserve flexibility in hiring and firing, which discourages hiring during uncertain economic times. If Europe wants to remain competitive in an increasingly globalized economy, flexibility is key. The ability to adapt to market disruptions, changing technologies, and new consumer preferences requires a nimble workforce, not one constrained by red tape and outdated labor laws. At the same time, Europe's labor force is aging out. The demographic time bomb is ticking away, and it won't be long before worker shortages become a chronic problem, especially in highly skilled sectors. The solution: immigration reform. Europe has to start attracting young, skilled workers not only from within, but from outside its borders. Otherwise, those shortages we mentioned earlier, like Germany's looming shortfall of up to 7 million workers by 2035, will evaporate any hopes of industrial growth and innovation. But what about tax reforms? In all fairness, the taxation system in many European countries is punishingly high, particularly for businesses and higher-income earners. The complicated tax code in countries like France, Belgium, and Italy dissuades investments and weighs heavily on potential entrepreneurs. The goal should be to stimulate investment, not stifle it. Europe needs to cut back bureaucratic burdens and taxes that kill business initiatives, particularly for small to medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, that are the backbone of the European economy. Infrastructure also needs a revamp. While Europe prides itself on having a well-developed infrastructure system, many regions, particularly in southern and eastern Europe, are facing crumbling transport links, poorly maintained public services, and overwhelming dependency on outdated resources. If Europe wants to keep pace with the major players like the US and China, real investment into next-generation infrastructure, such as high-speed rail, 5G networks, renewable energy grids, and AI-enabled technologies, must become the bedrock for sustained economic growth. Monetary tools can encourage some investment, but you can lower the cost of borrowing to zero, and it won't mean much if businesses don't see a future in their investments. Growth-enhancing structural reforms should be prioritized, with national governments taking the lead in unclogging bottlenecks, incentivizing innovation, and preparing Europe for the industries of tomorrow. If there's one area where Europe has lagged significantly behind both the United States and China, it's in innovation. Long gone are the days when Europe pioneered cutting-edge technology and led the world in scientific breakthroughs. Today, the continent finds itself trying to catch up as the U.S. surges ahead in fields such as space tech, green energy, AI, and biotechnology. On the other side of the world, China is fast emerging as a tech and industrial giant, leaving the EU in a dangerous middle ground, neither disrupting the market nor keeping pace. The biggest challenge here is a lack of investment in human capital. That is, Europe is not training, retaining, or attracting the talents it needs for future industries. The skills mismatch is stark. Many university systems in Europe are still producing large numbers of graduates in traditional academic fields, while the labor market desperately needs engineers, IT specialists, data scientists, and healthcare professionals. What's the antidote? Educational reforms must take center stage. Governments need to invest in institutions that can reskill and upskill workers for the jobs the economy truly demands. There also needs to be an overhaul of the education system to provide more emphasis on coding, artificial intelligence, robotics, and other future-oriented skills. And please, for Europe's sake, reduce bureaucracy and roadblocks for young entrepreneurs. Startups need more freedom to operate, not less. Authorities must remove the endless red tape that turns would-be entrepreneurs into frustrated office dwellers drowning in paperwork. Secondly, Europe must open the door wider for global talent. While many EU countries have started wooing skilled immigrants, they're still light years behind global competitors. At present, many skilled workers from Africa, Asia, and South America are more likely to head to countries that will offer them competitive wages and fewer complications, i.e., the US, Canada, or Australia. The EU needs to streamline visas for skilled foreign workers and make Europe a destination for top global talent, particularly in tech and emerging fields. Moreover, R&D spending must ramp up. Europe simply isn't spending enough on research and development to allow homegrown innovators to flourish. Governments need to broaden tax exemptions for research-intensive companies and invest more in public-private partnerships. The EU's Horizon 2020 program was a good start, but to get serious, Europe needs to triple down on similar initiatives that foster cutting-edge research, particularly in green energy, AI, nanotechnology, and biotech. The Eurozone isn't just suffering from central banking overreach, it's also facing intractable tensions between northern European creditor nations and southern debtor nations. Now that Angela Merkel, the longtime leader of Germany, has left the stage, the fiscal discipline rulebook that she strongly favored is also in dramatic flux. There is growing division on several fiscal rules, particularly regarding how much debt Eurozone countries can take on and how Germany continues to act as a massive, albeit begrudging, lender of last resort for weaker southern economies like Greece, Italy, and Spain. Many fiscally conservative northern countries, especially Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland, have clung to strict rules designed to limit debt and deficits, but crises like COVID-19 and the ongoing vulnerability of southern economies since the 2008 financial crisis have shown that Europe's fiscal framework is too rigid to deal with long-term economic shocks. The solution: more flexible fiscal rules that allow room for countercyclical policies. When economies are down, governments must have the freedom to engage in public investment, regardless of short-term debt accumulation. At the same time, there needs to be stronger enforcement mechanisms to prevent countries from following unbridled borrowing practices during good times, like what led to the sovereign debt crisis. This will require serious negotiation and probably uncomfortable compromises, but fostering long-term macroeconomic stability demands it. The stakes are high because if Northern and Southern Europe fail to come to terms on fiscal policy, the Eurozone may see a replay of the tensions that nearly tore it apart during the Eurozone crisis of the early 2010s. The last thing Europe needs is renewed speculation of a rift akin to a Grexit or even an Italexit. Another major priority for Europe needs to be energy independence. Let's talk realpolitik for a moment. As it stands, Europe is still far too dependent on external energy suppliers, especially Russia, from whom Europe imports huge volumes of natural gas. The war in Ukraine, which has disrupted energy pipelines and forced the EU to scramble for alternatives, ought to be a warning shot for policymakers. Not only has this dependency cost Europe vast sums of money, it has also vassalized parts of Europe into geopolitical weakness, especially when dealing with Russian aggression or Middle Eastern tensions. The solution isn't just about avoiding Russia or switching to other suppliers, it's about investing heavily in Europe's own renewable energy capacity. Germany's energy wind and France's nuclear energy program are good starts. Still, the continent as a whole is running behind its climate targets, and deep down, policymakers aren't investing fast enough in the green sectors of the future. So what are they waiting for? It's no secret that sustainable energy projects are expensive, but now is the time for massive public investments and incentives for private energy companies to innovate and deploy solar, wind, and hydrogen energy solutions. Recently, the European Green Deal proposed a sweeping €1 trillion investment to help Europe become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050, but we need to ramp up faster than that. By improving energy security and renewable investments, Europe would not only reduce its dependency on foreign energy, but it would also usher in a new industrial revolution, create jobs, and drive innovations that would turn Europe from a follower into a leader on the global stage again. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, Europe needs to tackle its own identity crisis. The EU is struggling with internal political fragmentation, as we've seen with Brexit and rising Euroscepticism in countries like Italy, Poland, and Hungary. As political discontent rises, the potential for deeper internal division becomes a lurking threat to the European project itself. The EU was conceived to unite Europe after the devastation of World War II, promoting peace and prosperity through collaboration and shared goals. But in the wake of financial crises, refugee influxes, and rising nationalism, that unity has been stretched thinner than ever. What we're witnessing now isn't just political squabbles in Brussels. It's a crisis of trust in both the EU's ability to govern effectively and the value of unity itself. Eurosceptic parties are gaining ground in major economies like Italy, Poland, and Hungary. These movements are leveraging public disillusionment with what they see as Brussels' overreach, particularly in economic policies, immigration, and sovereignty issues. The rise of these movements has created sharp political divides that make it harder to drive pan-European solutions to the pressing challenges we've discussed. So, what can be done to halt the drift toward disintegration or deeper fragmentation? 1. Rebalance sovereignty and centralization. One of the core challenges the EU faces today is the tension between national sovereignty and supranational decision-making. Countries like Poland and Hungary have actively pushed back against what they see as EU interference in domestic matters, particularly regarding judicial independence, social policies, and immigration. However, on issues like economic and climate policy, greater EU-wide coordination is essential. The solution, then, lies in finding a middle ground where national governments are given more leeway in non-economic areas, while a more coordinated and systemic approach is adopted in economic, environmental, and innovation policies. Greater regional autonomy on socio-political decisions, in tandem with strengthened EU institutions for tackling cross-border economic challenges, could ease tensions and improve national governments' willingness to cooperate on areas where cooperation matters most. But this will require EU institutions, like the European Commission and Parliament, to be more flexible and responsive to the concerns of member states, especially in Eastern Europe, where there is growing mistrust of Brussels. 2. Improved democratic accountability. Part of the EU's problem also stems from the perception that it is an opaque, undemocratic institution that is out of touch with the lives of average Europeans. To rebuild trust, the EU must become more transparent and accountable. This means Brussels needs to foster better communication between its institutions and its citizens throughout Europe. Many people simply don't understand how the EU functions, how decisions are made, or how policies affect them. And when things go wrong, like during the Eurozone debt crisis or the refugee crisis, it's easy to blame a distant bureaucrat. Boosting citizen participation in EU-wide decisions, perhaps through more referendums or local consultations on key issues, would reconnect the EU with its people. Furthermore, giving national parliaments a stronger voice within the EU structure, particularly in economic and fiscal decisions, could help mitigate the current backlash against what many see as top-down governance from a distant central authority. 3. More targeted, effective policy solutions. The EU will also need to prove that it can produce results that directly improve the lives of its members, particularly in areas like unemployment, living standards, competitive innovation, and climate resilience. Too often, the EU's focus on grand, long-term visions drowns out the urgent needs faced by ordinary people, particularly those in economically distressed regions. Consider that youth unemployment in places like southern Italy and Spain remains shockingly high, around 23% in 2024. Can we really expect young people from these countries to feel optimistic about a European project that barely provides them opportunities and a future? To solve this, the EU must prioritize targeted regional investment, focus on job creation in lagging regions, and incentivize the development of industries that match local growth potential. The EU's cohesion funds, which aim to bring the less developed regions closer to the richer parts, need to be much more agile and directly impactful. Central and Eastern European countries, in particular, feel that they are running the race with one leg tied. Better outcomes from targeted infrastructure investments, digital inclusion measures, and educational support for underrepresented regions would show that the EU isn't just a multinational banking agreement, but a living project that can address local disparities. For strengthening European identity, there's also the task, slow but critical, of fostering a pan-European identity. Trust will only blossom when Europeans see themselves as part of a common future, not just a beneficial market alliance. The rise of nationalism stems partly from a sense of disenfranchisement from broader European goals, leading citizens to look inward. The EU has an opportunity to reignite the hope of European integration by celebrating its diversity while promoting shared values. This includes investing in educational exchanges, cultural programs, and multilingual initiatives that cultivate a stronger sense of belonging, so that being European can one day mean more than just trade agreements and political treaties. It must come to mean shared purpose. 5. Creating fiscal rescue plans for next crises. Now, looking ahead, the elephant lurking behind every economic and political crisis is, what's the global plan B for Europe? There's a very real possibility that Europe will be caught off guard again in the next global crisis, whether it's triggered by geopolitical tension, climate disaster, or a financial market collapse. If any of these threats fully manifest, we will see another economic wave that's too big for individual countries to handle. Europe cannot afford the 2010-style debt crises to resurface. Europe needs a permanent fiscal capacity, call it a European Monetary Fund or an EU rescue fund for crises, that can step in quickly when economies within Europe are at risk of severe destabilization. The pandemic already led to an unprecedented joint debt issuance from the EU through the Next Generation EU Fund. This was a one-off solution, but it revealed that European cohesion is only truly tested when a collective fiscal response is deployed. Such fiscal stabilizers should be available without excessive political wrangling and delay. This institutionalized safety net would be used specifically for funding emergency investments, job recovery programs, and economic relief during tough periods, replenished during economically prosperous times as a form of fiscal insurance across the Eurozone. With a robust fiscal mechanism in place, Europe wouldn't have to rely solely on monetary ninjutsu from the ECB every time there's a hiccup in financial markets or economic shocks. This would provide macro-level flexibility, ensuring that both the private and public sectors can weather the next storm. So, where does this leave us? With all the noise about ECB rate cuts, slowing inflation, and geopolitical crises, it's painfully clear that Europe's problem isn't just about monetary policy. It's about deep, systemic issues that can't be fixed with easy money or quick fiscal band-aids. Interest rates alone will not save Europe's economy from demographic decline, productivity stagnation, regional inequality, or political fragmentation. If anything, the ECB's ceaseless tinkering with rates is a symptom of a deeper ailment. Europe is stuck, and no one's willing to make the hard, structural changes necessary to rejuvenate its economy for the next century. If the continent continues down this path of superficial fixes, the economic recession we're currently seeing might only be the beginning of a long, drawn-out stagnation. But there's still hope. Europe has a vast amount of potential world-class educational institutions, a skilled workforce, and technological prowess, if it can harness these strengths toward creating an integrated, innovative, and resilient economic future. The focus should now shift away from endless monetary fiddling to a bold, big vision, fostering long-term investment, sustainable growth, and the creation of a cohesive economic bloc that can thrive in turbulent global markets. Europe needs to take this moment of crisis to reconsider its path, unite on substance rather than convenience, and deliver the visionary changes that can restore confidence, both at home and on the global stage. Until then, the short-term fixes may prolong the game, but they won't win it. So, like I said, buckle up, dear viewers. If we keep relying on rate cuts and central banking magic tricks, it's going to be a long, bumpy ride ahead. But if Europe rethinks, restructures, and reforms, well, maybe there's a bright horizon out there after all. That's it for today. As always, stay sharp, stay informed, and keep questioning the status quo. Don't trust what they say, trust what you know, and always dig deeper. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time. Bright minds.